this is the Retire Sooner podcast, and so half of this show focuses, let's say, on the money side of retirement, so you can retire early. But the other half focuses on all of the life habits and skills we need to live a joyful retirement. And the one of the things that is this constant battle and constant struggle in let's call it a population that's stopped work, right? So they lose this giant social network, is friendship, connection, maintaining their social network. And I'm fascinated by the science behind it. And I started asking some questions recently, what in our brain clicks to actually make, what actually makes a friendship? And when you're, because I see people that it's pretty challenging if you're 70 and you've worked all your life and you haven't really focused in on socialization and to kind of restart. And it's hard for some people. It's really hard. So I wanted to have somebody on like you to go to the root of that and what our brain tells us, how I guess scientifically, how do we form connections? I think it's kind of a fascinating topic. So we're so happy we found you, and thank you for coming on the show.
I couldn't be happier to be here. And you know what? I mean, as I just turned 56 last week. And so the thought of retirement, not that I'm retiring anytime soon, started to pop into my head. And I'm thinking, okay, what is the right time? But the notion of kind of losing the web of connections that I have, at work, in my lab, the initiative that I run, and the myriad of people who are out there, students, that's a bit terrifying.
It is.
I could see becoming very lonely very fast.
Yeah, it's something that we have to. Our audience knows that it's a huge. It's a lot more work than just saving money and investing. I think it's the harder of the two. So can we start with I know that you're still teaching at Wharton, and you teach this class, the Introduction to Brain Science for Business. Can we just start, what am I learning in that class? What do you teach?
Yeah. It's a fascinating course. I mean, it's my personal baby, kind of created out of whole cloth. And the idea is to say, can we take the technology, the tools, the insights, the analytics from neuroscience and apply that to business to make business more efficient, more effective, and more humane? So there are myriad challenges in business that we've kind of reached a glass ceiling, if you will, in terms of like approaching them from economics or psychology, right? And the reason why is because the standard kind of way to ask those questions is by asking people questions using surveys, right? And we know that self-report is noisy, it's biased, sometimes it's an outright lie. So what neuroscience does is it gives us the technology to peek under the hood, to see what's really going on inside people's heads. Often it's very different from what they say, very different from what we can know ourselves. So those processes can inform our business practice in ways that we never thought possible before. So the low-hanging fruit there is marketing and brand strategy, where it's bona fide return on investment. You collect some scraps of brain-relevant data. You can use even the cheapest, most scalable technology, and you can optimize ads. They will perform better. You're going to get.
Hold on, go back to this low-hanging fruit too. Let's talk about. You're saying that it's not that difficult to find data on what truly triggers us.
That's right.
To your point, I love the term under the hood. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I think when most people, if you ask them, well, what's neuroscience? And they'll think of, it's a brain scan, it's taking pictures of somebody's brain, pretty colored, lights on brains. And that is, a standard method in neuroscience, but it's really expensive. It's really cumbersome. You have to go lie in an MRI machine in a hospital somewhere. You can't put it on a customer's head and, measure how their brain is responding to ads or to products or displays in a retail environment. And so we're now at a position where we have what I would call much more scalable technologies. So technologies that are lightweight, in many cases wearable. We've developed our own wearable brain sensing, high fidelity wearable brain sensing technology that can be worn by anybody, anywhere. and it's cheap now. So instead of spending millions of dollars, we're talking about hundreds of dollars. And it's really the question is like, how do you use that data? And what's really remarkable, and I didn't really think I'd see the day again, but it's happened over the last decade, which is that if I get a little bit of that data in a couple dozen people, I can predict what millions of people will do. I can predict what ads they will respond more favorably to. I can predict what moments in the ads are going to be effective at driving engagement, joy, feeling good about it, and remembering something about it so that at the point of purchase, the person's more likely to recall that information, more likely to actually buy, right? So we can now understand in a really fundamental way the why behind the buy.
Wow.
Why do people buy, right? So, and this is just marketing. So I think that's the tip of the iceberg, because think of all every aspect of business runs on brains. And what are the most difficult parts of business? Well, like hiring, like how do you actually go about hiring the right person for the right job? How do you precisely measure their intrinsic talents, traits, and motivators? How do you do the same thing for teams? How do you get teams to have chemistry and work well together? Where does innovation and creativity come from? And how can I structure a workday or workplace so that we maximize that? So those are all questions that we're working on, and we can demonstrate neuroscience delivers.
So Michael, what is you think about neuroscience as a layman, and you do think of the pictures we see, and it's MRI, and it's different colors in the brain. This lights up for that.
Yeah.
As an example of some of this newer technology, what are we wearing? What are we wearing, and what kind of feedback are we getting in the kind of a more scalable, less expensive way?
Yeah. So we use brain imaging for certain kinds of questions. Basically, we want to test a hypothesis like, the reason you avoided buying that stock was either because you were fearful of loss, or maybe you're not so good at calculating probabilities and making forecasts. Those could be different reasons. And we know that those live in different parts of the brain. Where it gets really interesting now is scalable wearable technologies. So not only are they lightweight, not cumbersome, don't interfere with what you're doing, but honestly, what we've created is a lightweight athletic headband that you could wear for 8-10 hours a day, honestly, and it provides clinical grade brain signals. These are electrophysiological signals, so think of it as brain waves. Everybody's kind of heard of brain waves, like when you sleep, your brain kind of slows down, and what we do is we take that data, which can be transmitted wirelessly, and you can decompose this sort of complex mush of brainwaves into individual waves that are either fast or slow or medium. And the sort of amplitude or size of those waves indicates different brain states, which can be things like how focused you are and how engaged you are in an ad, for example, or conversely, kind of how much your mind is wandering, or how creative you might be in the moment, how much stress you're feeling. One of my favorite probably is a metric we've come to know and love, which is called synchrony, which is this unbelievable kind of black magic phenomenon that is real and causal. But when we have a good relationship with somebody, when you just click with somebody, you have chemistry. It could be your partner, your spouse, could be somebody at work. You finish each other's sentences. What's really cool is that for those people, when they're together, their brain activity actually becomes synchronized.
Whoa!
And that indicates that they're kind of processing information in a very similar.
Did we know this?
Mindset.
Have we known this for a long time, or is this relatively new?
No. This is only the last few years, and so it's new knowledge. We now know it's not uniquely human. So we've observed it in monkeys and bats and mice and birds, all in social situations. And what's really cool about this is it's a biomarker or a biological marker of chemistry. So it's an indicator and a predictor of higher trust, better communication, better teamwork and collaboration, a higher likelihood of cooperating, all of these good things, in most business settings. And we found, for example, that it predicts performance of committees. So if a committee has a tough decision that they have to make, a committee that has higher physiological synchrony is more likely to make better decision than a committee that has lower physiological synchrony. Because when your synchrony is higher, you feel a lot more psychological safety. You find it easier to contribute your own thoughts to the discussion and conversation, so you don't get into groupthink, actually, which is a little bit of a surprise. And then it's easier to execute because you can all see the path ahead, right? So it's easier to get into alignment. And it turns out that synchrony occurs in audiences when they're viewing a movie or an advertisement that is particularly compelling. Okay, so a really well-made movie, a really well-made ad attracts everybody's attention in the same way and makes them feel the same things. And we're using this right now as a moment-to-moment indicator of the effectiveness of an ad at kind of creating a sense of us, like creating this kind of a collective effervescence. We're all in this together. We're part of this bigger thing, and which we believe will predict all kinds of good outcomes.
Is this why I like to watch TV or shows with people versus alone?
That's exactly right. So in the 19th century, the father of sociology, this guy named Emil Durkheim, he was fascinated by human rituals and the observation, like, why do people come together? Why do they go to church together, synagogue, mosque? Why do we do things in groups that you could do alone?
Yeah.
And there's this sense that there's like something different about the experience. Like you go to a football game, they play the national anthem, you're standing up, at least this happens to me, and the hair, what little hair I have left, stands up on the back of my head. You feel this weird like sense of togetherness. And Durkheim called this collective effervescence, which is a term I really love. And he postulated that that's the glue. That's the glue that keeps societies together. Okay, it allows us to work together instead of fighting each other. And what's really cool with regard to synchrony is that if you look at every culture on the planet has rituals in which we do rhythmic activities together. We sing, we dance, we march, we drum.
Since the beginning of time,
Every culture. And what we now know is that those activities turn up physiological synchrony. Okay, when we move together, we get in sync, right? And so that's what it's there for.
Yeah, it is. It's the feeling of church. I get that feeling. It's like I don't get it. It's a unique feeling of. I guess that's what it is. I've never had a term for it, but it's that synchrony feeling. I guess because so technically, the thought that our brain waves are in sync. I mean, I feel like this is a dumb question, but are our brain signals or wavelengths emanating and syncing up with someone else's, or no? It doesn't work that way.
So it's a great question. There are multiple levels at which this is occurring. So the first, and we'll get back to this, is we're wired to connect. We have a specialized, dedicated circuitry in our brains for managing our moment-to-moment interactions with each other and our long-term relationships. We'll talk about that later. So that's the system that gets engaged when I make eye contact with you. When we make eye contact, that system gets engaged, and the patterns of activity in the rest of our brain begin to resemble each other more. They become more synchronized. And this is accelerated by the production and release of a hormone called oxytocin, which you've probably heard of. And that's like a volume knob for the social brain network. It's a volume knob for synchrony in our brains. Now, that's the question you raised is the sort of black magic part, the sort of like witchcraft part. Like, how does my brain know what wavelength your brain is on? And we know it's causal because there's a beautiful study done in mice like a year ago. It was published showing you take 3 mice and you plant electrodes in the front of their brain in a part of the social brain network that's involved, a part of the brain that's involved in social interaction. So you deliver the same number of stimulation pulses to each of the 3 mice. So the amount of stimulation is the same. 2 of them you deliver it in sync, and 1 is asynchronously. The 2 who are stimulated synchronously come over and they start huddling and grooming each other. And the other one who's stimulated same number of stimulation pulses, but not in sync with the other 2, and is just kind of aloof and over there by himself. So somehow, no, we don't think this is being transmitted at a distance.
Okay, we do not.
But somehow they're
okay. Yeah.
But we can't rule it out, but it seems unlikely. A more likely option is that there are outward physical cues, manifestations. So, for example, when we make eye contact, our pupils begin to dilate and constrict synchronously with each other. We're unaware of that. We don't even notice it. but it's happening. Okay. So that's one outward cue. Our brains are, and that's how, I think it's a good illustration of the fact that we're not aware of, 99.9% of what's actually happening. So our brains are locking into that signal, and that begins to maybe be one of the generators of synchrony. There could be other cues like movement. And as I said earlier, when we move together, this tends to synchronize our physiology as well. So if you and I play this game, that's the most common warm-up game in improvisational theater, improv theater, where the whole name of the game is being really responsive to your teammates. What they do is they warm up together by trying to mirror each other's movements. They're getting in sync. Okay, so there are lots of pathways, we think, over multiple time scales. So we don't have to postulate some kind of scary action at a distance, but telepathy kind of thing. But it works, and that's the thing that's so shocking about it.
So if we go, let's just take a step back and talk about friendship. And I never even thought to ask this about anybody because I've never talked to a neuroscientist in behavioral science. But what is it that clicks? And obviously it seems like a really complex thing. What is it that clicks inside of us that says, oh, I feel we're going to be one, I'm comfortable with you, but then the next level is, oh no, I think we're actually, we have a friendship. And then how does that persist? Because it's a fascinatingly complex thing.
Yeah, it's a process. Okay. It doesn't just sometimes you feel like you just click, and I'll get to why I think that happens in a moment. It's important to point out that this adaptation for friendship, being wired to connect, is really deeply baked into our brains. So this is part of the human adaptive toolkit that we share with our non-human primate cousins. So monkeys, I spend half my time studying monkeys. We last shared a common ancestor with them 30 million years ago, and their brains are wired in exactly the same way ours are. They depend on each other. The more friends a monkey has, the longer the healthier the life they live. The more babies they have. For humans, the longer, happier, healthier life, and the more money you make as a human being.
Say that again. Say that's
so
humans. It's basically directly proportional. Your wealth, longevity, and happiness directly proportional in some way to your circle of connectedness.
So the more friends or deeper friendships, there's sort of two sides of the same coin. More friends you have, the longer, the healthier, the happier life, and the more money you make. Because honestly, being able to connect with people, being able to communicate, is a really effective skill in business, right? And what we also now know is that this skill and propensity, the temperament it takes to make and keep friends, is wired into our brains as well. So people who have more friends, this social brain network is actually bigger. So the sort of each of the brain areas that make up this social brain network that mediates our interactions with other people is a little bit thicker, the cortex. There are more connections between neurons, and the wires that connect these areas are thicker. Okay, which tells us that you can put more information there. You can put more people in there. You can put more records of the of the interactions we had together, right? Because friendship is a process, and it requires maintenance and investment. And that's one thing we learned from monkeys. Monkeys don't, they don't have money. What do they have? They have their time and they have their energy. And so when monkeys make friends, what they do is they spend all their time grooming together. So it's like they're picking through the fur of each other. It's not really a hygiene response. They are making a tactile investment in their relationship. And the more they do that together, the more likely they would be to help each other in the future. We do that by going to get a beer or get coffee with somebody, going to play tennis, whatever, those kinds of activities where you're investing your time and investing your energy in that relationship.
And what part of the brain is that, Michael? What part of the brain is that?
There isn't a single part. So it's a system, it's a network, okay, that kind of begins at the back of the head, where the pixelated view of the world that we get from our senses is reassembled into images like, oh, there's a person there, and oh, it's a familiar person, it's Wes, right? Then that information kind of flows forward in two pathways, two streams. One's a little lower in the brain, and it's more emotional in its processing. So it is constantly it's querying the data we're getting from our senses to see what's the emotional state of the person we're interacting with, basically from nonverbal cues, so facial expressions, tone of voice, posture, et cetera. And ultimately that will flow to a part of the social brain network that's involved in empathy. When we actively resonate with the emotional state of another person. And we know that the more activity you have in this brain empathy area, the more likely you are to actually help a person who's in need, to help your friend. So that's the emotional pathway. And then there's a kind of cognitive pathway that's a little higher up in the brain. And its job is to figure out what another person's mental state is. So what are they paying attention to? What do they think is important? What are they likely to do next? If you've interacted with them in the past, were they trustworthy? Were they reliable? Were they fair? Right? And then were they honest? And then those two streams come together to basically inform our estimate of the value of taking different actions, just like economists postulate. So do I approach this person to help them? Do I run away? Do we make a fair deal? Do I sell them, my coffee maker or whatever? And that's kind of how the whole system works. And it's really remarkably good at its job. And as I said before, the thing that's so amazing is that it's bigger in people that have more friends. Now, the critical question there is that what you're born with? Is it, just fate?
Yeah, that was my next question.
Can you do something about it? And there's certainly a component that's due to the DNA you got from your parents. Like if your parents are both introverts, there's a higher likelihood that your brain's going to be wired to be a little more introverted. But we now know that it's actually kind of more what you do with it. Your social brain network is like a muscle. The more you use it, the more it grows, right? So it's like, and that's what's kind of key here when you're asking about how do you make friends. Every little interaction, just starting a conversation, talking to the barista at the Starbucks, is kind of like getting on the treadmill for your social brain. It's like getting a little workout in. I wouldn't skip a day in the gym to stay physically healthy. We should never skip a day in the brain gym for keeping our brain, our minds engaged with other people. And that's, of course, what happens when we make, a new friend. And you asked about kind of what clicks. This whole process ensues. So when we say, I approach you, Wes, I don't know you from Adam. We start to talk. And if you're kind of a little bit like me, that's one thing that we know actually drives friendship. It's this concept of homophily, which is
say that one more time. It's homophily.
It's a homophily. So it's basically love of self is what it means. And it's been observed forever, but we now know it has like really deep biological roots. So
we do like people that are like us.
We do like people who are like us. We like people who share similar interests. That makes sense. But this is so deep. So it turns out that people are more likely to be friends with people who share their DNA than people who do not share their DNA. I'm not talking about you're related, but you just happen to, through some random assortment of genes, if you looked at the people in my social network, they would have more DNA in common with me than people who are not in my social network.
Wow.
And then you say, well, how does that happen?
Yeah.
And again, it's probably some physical outward manifestation of your temperament, your personality, your likes, your preferences, those kinds of things that our brains just pick up on naturally. So it's not necessarily conscious. And so we're kind of attracted to people who share similar interests, who like similar things, who have similar preferences. And then if that's true, the process goes a little bit deeper. So through conversation, as we reveal more about ourselves and we learn more about the other person, and our attention is devoted to them, then our brain activity starts to get more and more synchronized. In fact, we've demonstrated this. You can take people off the street who don't know each other, you bring them into the lab, and we give them a structured set of questions that was developed about a decade ago, 15 years ago, to promote friendship, basically. So they start out with kind of chit chat, and then it goes to deeper questions. As you move through those sets of questions, your physiology starts to synchronize. And I've seen people crying in front of each other, They don't want to stop this exercise. We've run this in, the US, in China, in Europe, Taiwan. It works everywhere. And our friends, colleagues up at Dartmouth have shown that just the process of having a conversation, what that does is it begins to bring your brains into closer alignment. And this is actually the critical part of forming a friendship. And I also think it's the antidote to the polarization that we see, in the United States right now, because we're not talking to each other.
Yeah.
We have no chance in getting kind of overlap in our brain activity.
Yeah. So this is, what do you call this? Is this like a well-known set of questions? It's like almost like and how long does this take? Is this like a 2-hour thing that people sit down with, or?
We usually give people about a half hour, but an hour is ideal, but you could spend an hour on one question. We happen to use a set of questions that's in the literature that's called Fast Friends, so literally becoming fast friends. But you can buy similar decks online. So there's a website called Actually Curious that has empathy building cards. There's another one from Dan Ariely's Irrational Labs. That's I think it's like No Small Conversations or something like that. And they even have a spice deck if you want to have a fun adult dinner party. So I think it's
so again, this is kind of a curate. And by the way, this works in any language?
We think so. I mean, this is, look, that's a gap in neuroscience just in general. The vast majority of research is done in the West, in, educated, industrialized, rich countries. But so far as we understand, and so far as I've observed, you see the same things everywhere because people are fundamentally people.
So that would lead us to so I think about the retiree who, again, they drop their social network. And the other thing too is what clearly happens over the course of a lifetime is that people move away, people get divorced, couples, the other couple gets divorced, somebody moves away, somebody changes jobs, somebody dies, somebody gets sick. So we do, if we had a static network today and there was zero cultivation of the garden, it would likely be it could be gone in 10, 15, 20 years. So assuming that it takes cultivation, goes back to the conversation we're having around, for people that aren't necessarily not so great or don't have a great social network, can they learn to be better at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I do want to point out that this tendency to have your social networks contract as you get older is also deeply rooted in our biology. So we see the exact same thing in monkeys. The most intense interest in socializing is during adolescence. The most attention that monkeys and humans pay to each other is during adolescence. That's why the social media kind of, has become such a problem, I think, for kids. And then it begins to fall off as we get older. It falls off less dramatically for females than it does for males in both monkeys and in humans. And we know that it's much harder for men to make and sustain friendships later in life than it is for women. Not coincidentally, men die at younger ages than women do. And we know there are relationships between kind of social support and your health and vitality in old age. And so it's really a question, again, of effort, of just making it happen. Put the devices down, put the paper down, and you have to put yourself out there. So I always liken this. We talked about the brain gym. If you haven't worked out in a while and you go to the gym, what's it like? It's painful. You get out of breath,
Yeah.
And you don't want to keep at it, but you have to keep at it to get in shape. And the same is true for making friends and keeping your brain healthy, vital, and alive. You have to keep working at it. Now, you have a question.
Yeah. Why? So man, I was going to ask about introverts versus extroverts and what the difference between those two, but then let's just go right to men. Why monkeys and humans? Why is it harder for men?
Well, that's a complex question.
but it is. But we know that it is true. That's true. Okay.
It is true. And I think let's start with monkeys. Okay.
Yep.
It's a little more objective. It's not as complicated as humans. So in monkeys, kind of like in people, very much like in people, where a female kind of it lives in terms of the resources, the capital she has, depends in large measure on her family and her friends. So females spend the bulk of their time socializing with each other, building up these relationships. That helps them determine access to resources, gives them other added benefits, which we can talk about in terms of what being around friends does for you. So their outcomes are very strongly determined by kind of friendships, quality of relationships. For males, it's a little bit less so because males are kind of they're in monkeys, their kind of reproductive interests are best served kind of going it alone or having one good friend or ally. And so that's kind of more what you see. Kind of monkeys get in line to be high status, males do. And then they kind of, in their prime of life, they might do well, and then kind of things begin to fall apart for them. And they typically invest so much energetically in those activities that it takes a lot of wear and tear on their bodies. Now, something perhaps maybe similar might be going on in humans, where there's more of a kind of pressure, let's say, more impetus. So, I mean, some of it may be historical, whatever, but males just tend to get into higher risk jobs, higher risk careers, physically and economically, which means a greater variance in outcomes. And perhaps then they're devoting less time and effort and energy to building and sustaining relationships and friendships. So kind of like after they've gone through that, early and kind of prime of life, so to speak, but kind of mid period of life where you've been investing probably a lot of your time and effort in career. Now, when that's winding down, what do maybe you don't have the skills, maybe you don't have the network left anymore, you don't have the interests. So it might take extra effort.
Yeah. So there's more, maybe there's more of that social, the social brain network. Maybe there's more atrophy. And I tend to see this maybe a little bit more with entrepreneurs that are so dedicated to their careers where they're not 40-hour a week type people. They're 80, they're just 24/7. And it's real tough for an entrepreneur that was so dedicated to the business to then all of a sudden have, wait a minute, like, what do I do next? Like, oh, wait, I got to go meet people. And I think at 65, I don't think it's super easy to meet people. It would be at age 65. I mean, I think about the size of weddings, right? The size of weddings, when you're 25, you go to a wedding, every wedding's like 200 people, whatever, it's giant. And then you go to a wedding, it's somebody who's 50, those weddings are like 50 people. Now, I don't know if that is a direct proportion there, but maybe that's just, I don't know, maybe that's just getting smarter.
I think it's an interesting observation. Maybe it is getting smarter, but it does follow that arc that I described, which is kind of your interest in and investment in social relationships and social information in general. Your attentiveness, just like if you just look at how much time people or monkeys spend looking at the faces of others, it peaks in adolescence, kind of late teenage years, and then begins to drop off, and it's much reduced in the later stages of life. Now, that's kind of on average. Now, some people exceed that, and some people are worse, right? And given what I've already said, people who are kind of worse are going to kind of fare worse, right? If you've tended to neglect your relationships and you have less social support, you're just physically not going to live as long. So we now know that loneliness, this is really powerful stuff. The Surgeon General just had an advisory come out, but the data goes back over the last 20 years. Loneliness, which is the gap between the social interactions you want to have and what you're actually having, is worse. The impact on your quality of life years and your lifespan is worse than smoking a pack of cigarettes a day or being grossly overweight or having type 2 diabetes. It is a fun, and that reflects how fundamental our social connections are for our health and well-being.
It seems kind of easy to define loneliness, but it's probably not as black and white as we may make it seem to be. I guess there is probably a loneliness continuum, right?
Yeah. Well, and it gets back to you brought up introverts and extroverts. And this is not terminology that we tend to use in neuroscience, but it's fine to work with it. There's sort of people who are more interested in and invested in social interactions and people who are less, right? And that could be because they're either not motivated to do so, it's not interesting, or it makes them anxious, right? There's sort of different reasons why people might not put themselves out there. But nevertheless, like, even if you're an introvert, working on your social connections will boost, it'll turn up your social brain network. It will make it bigger and stronger, and it will lead to better outcomes. So it's kind of like the old MBA adage, which is, fake it till you make it. Even if it feels wrong to you, like you don't, it feels uncomfortable, forcing yourself to actually get out there and talk to people will have the desired impact in the long run.
So within neuroscience, you don't necessarily utilize, you guys don't use introvert versus extrovert, but what you do see is but you are saying that it's a little less work for an extrovert to have a larger network of social connectedness.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
And then I guess there's the deepness of that too. So sometimes you see an extroverted person who, friendly to all, friends with none, or you can end up being surface oriented. And then I think of the classic introvert that might have, a couple really good deep friendships. I guess I go back to the deepness of the friendship, the power of the friendship, because you mentioned there's both the quantity of people that we know, and then how deep those friendships really are. Mm-hmm. I guess that's the other layer of this. It's like 101 is we got to get some friends. 201 is you've got to have some of those friendships actually be deep. And is that just the process you were alluding to? It takes time.
It takes time, but what's really kind of remarkable is that there seem to be two routes to the same outcome. So you could either have a lot of fairly superficial social connections, or you could have a couple of really deep social connections, deep friendships. And both of those can lead you to, longer life, greater happiness, et cetera. So they both have, and I think what strategy works best for you is just idiosyncratic and personal. So for some people, the social butterflies, it's more effective to maintain many superficial relationships. And for others, having those two really, really best friends, right, could be the critical, piece of life. And so the data really does show that either pathway is one that can work.
So again, that is, I guess, the idiosyncraticness of our personalities is what determines that or not. Either way, right. We know we need to have some level of either quantity or quality. We've got to get there in either direction. So again, you had mentioned, so this is physical health, mental health, friendship. We know that this is so important. I always I think of this as almost just it's the village effect of somebody, you get sick. If you're kind of lonely, you could go a long period of time and not get it taken care of. But if you got a couple nagging good friends, it's like, right. We've got the propensity. Oh, you need to go get this checked out. So I've always thought of our network as that. But are you saying there is that a big chunk of it, just the village effect? I'm going to take care of my fellow villager or friend. Or is there something that actually makes us healthier when we have these connections?
So it's not fully fleshed out yet, but here's the picture that's emerging. One component of the impact on your health is exactly as you described. It's what we would call instrumental. That is, other people, friends, your connections are sort of, they're tools that help you to get resources that you need, right? Sometimes you might think of those as alliances. In primates, we might call those alliances, but I think they fundamentally share the same underlying processing. And it's that like if, like for example, the monkeys we study on this monkey island off the coast of Puerto Rico, and we studied the impact of an extreme stressor, a natural disaster, a hurricane that hit the island. And this hurricane caused the monkeys to rapidly age. This is actually something we could go into more detail. So the stressor, what it did, and we believe this is happening all over the planet, is it accelerated the aging process. But it did so more in some monkeys than other monkeys. So the average monkey aged 2 years just by going through this hurricane. That's 8 years of human life. I wouldn't want that. Wow. Some monkeys aged twice that amount, and some monkeys aged, half that amount. And the critical difference is whether or not they reached out and they made more friends. So monkeys who were suddenly they're faced with this destroyed environment, what they did was they reached out and they made more friends. They were more likely to survive. And the reason is because the critical resource now after the hurricane was shade. Basically, all the trees were killed, very little shade left. The island became 8 degrees hotter. So it's a huge thermoregulatory burden. So every animal, every monkey there had to figure out how to make friends with the right monkeys so they could sit in the shade with them. So they became less aggressive and more tolerant. So that's an instrumental effect. Now we see another impact as well. And this is a little harder to document. But one of the major ways that our bodies begin to age, and which we saw in the monkeys accelerated really rapidly, is we see the breakdown of cells and body tissue due to what's called inflammation. So, when you've got an infection of some sort, right, you get this inflammatory response. We talked about that a lot with COVID, like this sort of cytokine storm, this massive amount of inflammation. And that begins to take wear and tear on your body and in your brain. Being with your friends seems to help protect against inflammation and we don't understand the mechanisms precisely, but it reduces stress kind of directly. It reduces what we call arousal. So that's your alarm bells in your brain that are going off and that release cortisol and other chemicals into your brain and into your body. And being with your friends attenuates that. It calms you down, and that helps to reduce the impact of inflammation on your body.
Yeah, I can't help to think working in an office with people versus the world we live in working from Zoom, work from home, the long-term implications of work from home relative to being in the office. I think practically as a company, our company, we've got let's call it about 100 people, or call it 80 to 100 people on our floor that are all either the same company or related companies. And you think about what a day is like if you're working from home, and then you think of a day when 50 people are in the office. I mean, it's like, it is so vastly different. And in the world that we live in today, where we do both, and there's this hybrid work, I'm able to see those dramatic differences between being together or just working from home. Is there I would suspect there's got to be some science around this work from home that I haven't really read much about it, but the articles in the Wall Street Journal are employers are fighting with their employees to get them back. I don't see any stories around the long-term effects of just working out of your basement.
Yeah, I mean, this is a critical question. It's something we are working on directly with a number of companies right now to try to help them figure out how to get it right. It's clearly the case that this kind of interaction is not the same as being in the same physical space together. Our brains are designed to exist with people in 3 dimensions, where there's a vast array of physical and other kinds of cues.
Like our pupils can't quite track on Zoom.
It's impossible. I can't even make eye contact with you. It's actually impossible. Now, the truth is, as a science, we were caught flat-footed by the pandemic. And nobody could do any research really for like a year after it onset. So we're just now trying to pick up those pieces. So, our understanding is still rudimentary in terms of what's different. So that's just kind of, unfortunately, where we are. I will say, and this has actually been documented, one of the best things you can do to keep your brain healthy and alive, in addition to having friends, is to be physical, to be active, to get out and exercise. And one thing that I think has been overlooked is that when you're sitting at home all day and you're not commuting, you're not walking around the office, you're not going up and down the stairs, people are logging thousands of steps less every day. And if you look at the cumulative effect of that, let's say over years or decades, what's the impact going to be on the health of your body, but also your brain? So we know that like one of the best things you can do to keep your brain healthy when you're older is to keep physically active, right? It's a big impact on dementia incidence. It turns out though that keeping socially active is about twice the impact of physical activity. So
I can, if I had to choose between the gym and playing golf with 8 guys, I'm gonna have to. I would choose golf then.
Go play golf with 8 guys. Just walk the course. Don't ride the cart.
Yeah, that I guess that takes care of both. That's why the Scottish golfer they don't use carts in England and Scotland. So I think it's like the ultimate. It's the ultimate socialization. What about if you looked at the brain and you were to measure this, whether you were talking about the way, whether it's an MRI or any sort of brain activity, the difference between what are you seeing if when someone is helping someone or engaging or giving relative to having some sort of selfish act?
It's a great question. And again, it's not sort of the one thing I want to dispel is that there's sort of one area that turns on and turns off when we do these things. It's sort of the concerted effort.
Yeah. Okay. It's like a map lighting up. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So what's really remarkable is that how wired we are to give, most of us. So there's a network in the brain that we call the brain's value network. Think of it as reward. And, let's say, so it lights up, it becomes active when you win money, you win the lottery, when you eat a piece of chocolate, when you have sex, etc. Now, when you give money to your favorite charity or you give money to a person who's in need, those same parts of the brain are active. They can be just as active as when you're getting something yourself. I mean, that is really remarkable. We call this kind of mirroring. It's kind of a form of synchrony, one way to interpret it is that economists have talked about the warm glow of giving. And that warm glow is a real thing. It's actually in your brain, and it's the activation of circuits that give you pleasure, circuits that reinforce your behavior to make you more likely to do it. That's why, in fact, giving to somebody who's an identifiable victim, somebody that you see on the street, like when you have, there are different kinds of campaigns for eliciting charity. One is a lot of information, kind of effective altruism, lots of numbers. These are all the number of people you're going to help and blah, blah, blah. Or the other is sort of the identifiable victim. There's a person, right? And you can see the effect of actually giving on that person's well-being, on their joy, right? Reduction in sorrow. That's, in a sense, more effective because that's what our brains really respond to, not these numbers, but to the, all these cues that our brains are designed to respond to. To put this in perspective, for the vast majority of human prehistory, millions of years, our ancestors lived in small groups, probably somewhere between 40, certainly no more than 100 individuals that you had face-to-face contact with every single day, right? Those are the conditions that our brains evolved to survive and thrive in. That's not the conditions in which we find ourselves now. We can simultaneously interact with thousands of people, but not all in the same room, right? And our connections, as you mentioned earlier, can be disrupted as your children move across the country, or they go off to college and you don't see your grandkids. That never would have happened in human prehistory.
Right. But I got a job in California. I'm moving to California. Goodbye. I'll see you twice a year. Right. It didn't happen. To your point, anthropologically, I don't know if that's the right word, but we used to live in groups of 4 to 100 people.
40, let's say 40 to 100.
Oh, 40 to 100 people. Right. But but you didn't used to move away, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now we do. So it's a unique challenge then, right? So that's a unique challenge of modern society. Gosh, I even think about not that long ago or other cultures, we tend to children tend to live with their parents or near their parents, where in America we have such individualism, I guess, in America. Families spread out all the time, and it's
we published a paper. I published a paper with my colleague Peter Sterling last year. We were both feeling really motivated by this observation that in the U.S. we've seen an epidemic of what's called deaths of despair, especially in middle to older age adults, especially in rural areas. So these are deaths due to drug overdose, alcohol, but other cardiovascular disease, accidents,
deaths of
despair.
Okay.
So and it was a term coined by Angus Deaton, a Nobel economist who began writing about this 10 or 15 years ago. And you don't see it in other Western industrialized, educated, rich countries. And so we had to ask ourselves, well, what is the difference here? And surely some of it has to do with, people not having access to the resources that they need. But we think a big part of it is this sort of fractionated kind of society that we live in. So if you look at, anthropologically, it always took 2 generations to raise the 3rd generation, right? So a human child, because of their huge brains, actually didn't become a productive member of society until they were 25 or older. There was no expectation that they would. They were completely cared for by grandparents and parents all together. And now we find ourselves in the US, where that is certainly not the norm at all. Not only is it not 2 generations, but it's maybe half a generation. So there's, lots of people, face difficult challenges of sort of single parenting, et cetera. I'm not saying anything about kind of lifestyle choices, but with regard to just the demands of raising a very large-brained primate, to be a productive member of society, have always gone well beyond a single individual, right? And then if you see that, that's also compounded by the fact that it's also less opportunity for kids growing up to have a rich, vibrant social network that also remains somewhat of a constant in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I grew up in Ohio in a kind of small working class community, and everybody I knew I had an extended family of like 100, and I saw them all the time because nobody moved away, and so they were always there. I mean, for better or for worse, but I always knew they were there. I look at my kids, we moved around all the time. Right. So, they've got proxies for family. They've got sort of friends of friends, but it's not really the same thing.
And then I guess if we go, I want to ask you about the number of close connections. And then I want to ask about social media in just in a minute. But I'm trying to remember one of I think it may have been Dan Buettner, the author of Blue Zones, or some. I've heard it a couple times, but I don't know if I found the right source on it. But have there been studies on the number of close connections or friendships and then how that's waned over the last 30 or 40 years? Is that true? Like, we used to have 3 close friends on average, and now we have 1.5. Is that true?
Oh, I don't know about that. I haven't heard those numbers. I thought you were angling toward this other notion. There's a number, sort of magic number, 120. Which has been promoted by a scientist named Robin Dunbar.
Well, let's go to that. That seems more
interesting.
So
that's supposed to be kind of the maximum number of connections that a human brain can maintain, because it sort of looks like a constant across history and across societies. And now we find ourselves, of course, many of us in situations where we're kind of managing hundreds or thousands of relationships, but also not doing so particularly well or in a realistic way. There's been a lot of debate about whether this is kind of a hard limit, but I think we can all kind of have the sense that, having that number of friends is not really they're not really friends.
Right. Realistic. Right.
Yeah. Realistically, because not in the sense of our brain really tracking and having lots of interactions with them, but then tracking them and then this kind of playing out over a lifetime. Whether we have fewer friends now than we used to, I don't know if there's hard data on that, but it certainly seems to be the case. right? And it seems to be the case, and I think that's particularly true for men. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the book Bowling Alone, where if you think back to the 50s and 60s, there's this sort of everybody belonged to bowling leagues. You had your own bowling ball. It was like, but people were getting out there, and they had friends, and they would hang out, and nobody does that anymore. The best you can do is get online and do virtual bowling.
Virtual. So let's go back to this concept of a kind of a maximum amount of actual connections. I think you used the word tracking, 120 or so. Mm-hmm. And then social media that people have hundreds or thousands of LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever it may be. Has social media, do you think, has it pushed down the number of actual people we're friends with versus virtual friends?
That's a great question. I'm sure somebody knows the answer to that. I mean, I do think the data, you will often hear in the media, the evidence is equivocal on whether social media is harmful. And, the Surgeon General just came out again with another warning about social media and kids. I think the data is really clear on this, that the more time you spend on social media, especially as a kid, the worse it is for your mental health, particularly for young girls, because of the tendency to invite, social and physical comparison. Look, these apps are designed by scientists who have really good grasp of neuroscience. The algorithms are designed to be as addictive as possible. And, I think that what happens then, first of all, what happens in a kid who's growing up a digital native compared to you or me is probably very different. So we didn't grow up with cell phones in our hands. We grew up, we had to go, if you wanted to talk to somebody, you had to go next door to, knock on their door and go talk to them, right? Maybe pick up the phone. So that's our brains developed the capacity for real interactions. We had to. But now kids are growing up, they're on a phone, maybe they're texting, they're emojiing back and forth. It's a really reduced form of interaction and communication. It's so impoverished that there's a potential that the brain mechanisms, the pathways that we've talked about throughout this hour, right, that those pathways just don't develop as fully. So you've got a couple of things going on. You've got an addictive stream, like pressing a bar for cocaine, which in a rat, given that opportunity, they'll do that to the extreme where they won't eat, they won't drink. But now it's for social comparison. And it's like, I need to be more like that person. My life isn't as glamorous. My body doesn't look as good, right? So I think that those are a number of the forces that are really tearing at young people today as they kind of descend more deeply into social media addiction.
So as we wrap up today, I think that, and again, because you have had, you understand this at such a deep level relative to, again, from a brain science or a neuroscience perspective, what is your take on, let's call it, the challenges that we've talked about, and I think you say are really well agreed upon, that it's tougher for males later in life to stay connected or find new connections. And then the epidemic of loneliness. I remember reading about I think the UK had a commission or a government agency of loneliness. And now our Surgeon General, right, is said that it's a real epidemic. That plus aging in retirement, it's harder to find people and connect with people. I guess what is maybe just your advice or your takeaway on what we should be doing, or somebody who's, and you mentioned that you're thinking about it. Like you're only 56, I am. But wait, you're freaked out about, wait a minute.
I am thinking
to
about
combat loneliness. Yeah.
I think first of all, it all boils down to, you got to get out there. You got to put yourself out there. I think, that can be potentially harder in the kinds of communities that most people find themselves in. So if you're living in the suburbs, let's imagine you've done well, for example. So you've got a big house with a big plot of land, and maybe there are no sidewalks even. So there's actually like physical barriers to you interacting with other people and making connections, right? So you have to like drive somewhere to a meeting point. I think that's a big challenge for a lot of people, which is it becomes so much more intentional, and they have to be intentional about it. Oh, we're going to go to a hiking meetup. Or we're going to go to the coffee shop. That's a good place to go and just sort of strike up conversation. If you live in a city, it's a very different experience because you walk out your door and then there's people everywhere, and you can walk one block and, there's multiple different opportunities to engage. And there is this kind of, I don't know how prevalent it is, but there is a movement for, retirees to retire in cities, to move. That can be expensive proposition, but those are communities that are really vibrant and where there are just a lot of people. And where there are a lot of people, it's just a lot easier to meet people.
Yeah, so it's really the community making it easier for yourself to be in a place that it's socialization and meeting people is hard enough. If you live on a farm and it's 10 minutes from the nearest town, everything becomes more difficult from a social engagement. It's much more intentional. Yeah.
Exactly.
And maybe that's the other thing is that obviously there's a real prevalence of these 55 plus communities.
That's true. I mean, that's another way. Yeah. I mean, I think that's another way. Absolutely. And, I could see that being very attractive.
I love too the thought that you mentioned that we are designed again to interact in three dimensions, and even though I can tell I'd like to go get a beer with you,
right?
This is pretty good, right? It's pretty good, but we are designed to do, and that is that is based in science. You're saying that's not an opinion.
When a baby, first an infant, a newborn, emerges from the womb, they have a preference to look at faces and to look at stimuli that have the right configuration of things that look like eyes and a mouth. You can take those in eyes and mouth and put them upside down or in different configurations. They won't look at it. So you're wired from birth to seek out faces. Okay. There was I don't know, I can't remember the attribution of this quote, but famous psychiatrist who said, we're born looking for a face, not a screen. I think that kind of says it all, right?